Dead America, Tales from Las Vegas, The First Party Bus, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. The morning crested over the horizon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink. Nellis Air Force Base stretched out beneath it, already alive with movement. Soldiers and civilians moved between buildings, vehicles rumbled to life, and voices carried across the tarmac. The base had transformed from a military installation into something else entirely, a sanctuary for the survivors of the dead world. There was a buzz in the air, an energy that crackled through every conversation and hurried footstep. It was the kind of excitement that came from purpose, from the knowledge that today marked a turning point. For weeks the survivors had been running, hiding, fighting just to make it through another day. But today was different. Today they stopped running. Today they began fighting back. Captain Foster walked down the airstrip, a cup of instant coffee in his hand. The liquid was lukewarm and bitter, but it was caffeine, and that was all that mattered. He savored these quiet moments, this calm before everything kicked into motion. A few people passed him as he walked, offering nods and greetings. He returned them with a slight raise of his cup. These were his people now, soldiers and civilians alike, all of them grateful for the walls that kept the dead at bay. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. While the main focus had been on preparing for the clearing operation, Foster had allocated resources to rescue missions as well. He knew what was coming would require manpower, real boots on the ground, and that meant bringing in every survivor they could find. The civilians who arrived were put to work, given purpose, given hope. It made a difference. He could see it in their faces, in the way they carried themselves. After 10 minutes of walking, Foster downed the last of his coffee. The taste lingered on his tongue as he turned toward one of the hangars. The building loomed ahead, its massive doors rolled open to reveal the operation within. Inside, the space had been transformed. Where fighter jets and transport planes once sat, there were now party buses. Dozens of them, lined up in rows with enough space between each one for the mechanics and welders to work. The sound of tools and machinery echoed off the metal walls, punctuated by shouted instructions and the hiss of welding torches. Foster walked up to the closest bus, the one nearest the door. He circled it slowly, taking in the modifications. The transformation was remarkable. Metal bars had been welded around the sides, creating an additional 6 inches of protective barrier. The welds were solid, professional work that would hold up under stress. Protective shielding covered the tires and wheel wells. Angled plates designed to push anything that got run over to the side rather than pulling it underneath. Every window had been reinforced with metal mesh, and the front bumper had been replaced with a reinforced steel ram. It looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie, which Foster supposed was appropriate given the circumstances. "What do you think, Cap?" a voice called out. Foster turned to see Sergeant Hanson and Private Parker approaching. Hanson was built like a bulldog, compact and solid, with the kind of face that suggested he had seen his share of trouble. Parker was younger, leaner, with an energy that bordered on nervous excitement. "Does she look like she's ready for battle or what?" Parker asked. Foster ran his hand along one of the metal bars, testing the weld with his fingers. It was solid, no give at all. "I think we're pretty much there, don't you?" Foster asked. "I think we're about as close as we're ever going to get," Hanson said. The sergeant stepped closer to the bus, his eyes scanning the modifications with a critical gaze. He had been pushing for this operation for days, growing more restless with each delay. "If we don't get this operation underway soon, I'm going to lose my mind," Hanson said. Foster understood the sentiment. There was only so much preparation a person could do before the waiting became its own kind of torture. The time had come to act. "I think you're right, Sarge. It is time to kick this off. Parker, are you on board?" Foster asked. "Yeah, Cap. I'm riding shotgun with Hanson," Parker said. "Who was your third, Thomas?" Foster asked. Hanson and Parker shared a look, something between amusement and anticipation. Then Hanson turned toward the interior of the hangar and raised his voice. "It's about that time," Hanson called out. The sound of heavy footsteps answered him. A moment later, Magnus appeared from behind one of the buses, his massive frame impossible to miss. The man was a giant, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the aisle between vehicles. He carried his warhammer resting on one shoulder, the weapon looking almost casual in his grip despite its size. There was a confidence in the way he moved, the bearing of someone who had faced death and walked away. Foster let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "I thought you boys headed back to the Coliseum last night," Foster asked. "I sent Aldrich and Cade back, but the sergeant here asked if I would come along on the initial ride," Magnus said. His voice matched his frame, deep and resonant. Hansen stepped forward, gesturing toward the Gladiator. "I figured it was the right thing to do. We wouldn't be here if they hadn't come to our aid, and after seeing what they did in the parking lot of the party bus building, I figured having a badass tagging along wouldn't be the worst idea," Hansen said. "Hey now, am I not a badass?" Parker asked. "In your own way," Hansen said. The sergeant barely contained a smirk as Magnus stepped over and wrapped his arm around Parker's shoulders. The private looked small next to the Gladiator, almost comically so. "If you wish to learn the ways of the Gladiators, I will be honored to train you personally. Once we are done here, I will take you to the Coliseum and begin your training. There will be blood and bruising," Magnus said. He looked down at Parker, a broad smile crossing his face. The private's expression shifted from pride to concern. "Captain, I'd like to officially put in for some shore leave," Parker said. Foster let out a laugh, the sound echoing in the hangar. "I can't spare you just yet, but I would pay to see you in the Gladiator arena. First things first, though. We have to get this show on the road," Foster said. Hansen looked over at Parker and gestured toward the door of the party bus. Parker nodded and moved toward it, climbing up the steps and settling into the driver's seat. The interior was garish, even after all the modifications, with colorful LED strips lining the ceiling and plush seating designed for comfort rather than combat. Parker reached out and turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life with a deep rumble that vibrated through the frame. The interior lights began flashing on and off in a programmed sequence, cycling through colors. Then the CD player kicked on, and music blasted through the speakers at full volume. It took a moment for the song to register. When it did, the upbeat disco tune filled the hangar with its unmistakable rhythm. The sound bounced off the walls, loud enough to make conversation difficult. Parker's hand shot out and cut the engine. The music died with it, leaving sudden silence in its wake. "No, no, hell no. Somebody needs to go find another CD," Parker said. His voice carried out through the open door of the bus. Hansen walked closer, looking up at him. "What's the problem, Parker?" Hansen asked. "Yeah, what's the problem? It's loud and catchy. Every zombie in a mile radius will be coming your way, which is exactly what we want," Foster said. Parker leaned out of the driver's seat, his expression serious, despite the absurdity of the conversation. "First off, the thought of having to listen to that for the next 6 hours would be enough to make me want to do a header into a crowd of those things," Parker said. He paused, then continued. "And secondly, I don't want to run the risk of the last thing I ever hear on God's green earth being disco music," Parker said. Magnus stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I agree with Parker. Disco is no soundtrack for a warrior to enter the afterlife to," Magnus said. Hansen and Foster exchanged a look. Then both started laughing. "Okay, we'll find something a little more appropriate for battle. In the meantime, let's go over the plan again," Foster said. "Sarge, you do it. I'm going to need some time to get that god-awful song out of my head," Parker said. "Sure thing, Parker. We're going to drive around the area, music blasting on full, luring as many of those things as we can. Once we have a small army of the dead following us, we're going to hit the I-15, taking us to the northeast," Hansen said. Foster crossed his arms, his mind running through the logistics one more time. "How far up are you going?" Foster asked. 40 miles, give or take. We keep the horde within view until we pass Glendale, then speed up for a few miles to give time for the helicopter to land," Hansen said. "Then it's back to base for drinks and a good night's sleep before we wake up and do it all again tomorrow," Parker said. Magnus looked between them, his brow furrowed slightly. "Surely we're not the only people who are going to be driving these," Magnus said. Foster shook his head. "We have a few more teams that are getting prepped, but you're the only ones heading out today. There's a lot of civilians involved in this operation, and I want to work out the kinks before we go full tilt," Foster said. "Understandable. I know that all civilians aren't as battle-tested as I am," Magnus said. "Well, once you put them through their paces at the Coliseum, I'm sure they will be," Foster said. Magnus's eyes lit up, and he straightened slightly. Captain, are you offering me my own gladiator army? Magnus asked. Once we clear the city, we're going to need defenders. I can think of no one better, Foster said. Magnus gave a slow nod, the gesture one of respect and acceptance. This was the kind of purpose he understood, the kind of mission that made sense in a world gone mad. Parker stepped out of the bus, his earlier frustration replaced with renewed energy. All right, let's go find some proper music and get this show on the road. Chapter 2. Sergeant Hansen kept the speed on the party bus, slow as it crept down the neighborhood street. The music from the speakers blared at full volume, a rock anthem that pounded through the air with enough force to rattle the windows. The bass thumped so hard they could see the glass vibrating ever so slightly in its frames. Every house they passed remained dark and empty, their occupants long gone or worse. The street was lined with single-story homes, each one a cookie-cutter version of the next. Manicured lawns had grown wild, and a few cars sat abandoned in driveways with their doors hanging open. The scene had become familiar over the past few hours, just another suburban neighborhood, frozen in the moment everything fell apart. Hansen made the next turn at the end of the block, the bus handling the corner with surprising ease despite its bulk. The new street revealed itself, and he could see it was the last one in this neighborhood. The houses here looked much the same as all the others, quiet and still. He glanced down at the gas gauge and saw the needle sitting at half full. "What do you think, Parker? One more neighborhood and we call it good?" Hansen asked. Parker had a tablet resting on his lap, the screen showing a digital map of the area. He tapped it a few times, zooming in on their location and studying the streets ahead. His finger traced a path along the roads as he considered the options. "There's an apartment complex a block down. I say we get back out to the main road, hang a right. Then do a drive-by before heading to the interstate," Parker said. "Sounds like a plan to me. That cool with you, Magnus?" Hansen asked. Hansen and Parker glanced back into the party bus, looking past the rows of plush seating. The large gladiator had claimed one of the oversized seats near the back, his legs stretched out in front of him. He held something in his hand, a festive-looking glass that had probably once been filled with champagne at some party that felt like it happened in another lifetime. His head bobbed to the music, and when he noticed them looking, he gave them a thumbs up. "If only we could all have that much fun," Parker said. The duo went back to looking out the front windshield of the armored party bus. 20 creatures stood in the road ahead, packed tightly together as they marched toward the source of the music. Their movements were stiff and awkward, but there was purpose in them. The sound had them entranced, drawing them forward like moths to a flame. Hansen slowed down a little further, easing off the gas until the bus was barely moving. He let the front edge make contact, the reinforced bumper pressing into the first few creatures. The impact was gentle, almost careful, as the bus pushed them aside. The creatures pressed against the welded metal at the front, their bodies pushed to either side as the vehicle's momentum carried it forward. Some of them clawed at the sides, their fingers scraping uselessly against the reinforced panels. Once they got to the other side of the small mob, Hansen increased the speed slightly. He watched in the side mirror as the creatures turned and followed, joining the larger group that trailed behind them. The reflection showed a mass of bodies, all moving in the same direction, all following the music. It was impossible to tell exactly how many there were from this angle, but the number was growing. Hansen drove them to the edge of the neighborhood, the houses giving way to a wider street. Out of habit, he flicked on his turn signal. The clicking sound filled the cab, steady and automatic. Parker noticed and let out a laugh. "Are you afraid you're going to get a ticket?" Parker asked. Hansen let out a sigh and flipped the signal into the off position. "My driver's ed teacher was a lot of things. An alcoholic, a terrible driver, and verbally abusive, but he was a stickler for turn signals," Hansen said. "I guess the verbally abusive side helped that lesson sink in," Parker said. "It did. It also helped me learn a lot of new curse words," Hansen said. "He taught you proper road etiquette and helped give you the vocabulary for a life in the uniform. Sounds like a stand-up guy to me," Parker said. "Oh, for sure. He was my favorite teacher by a mile," Hansen said. "Any idea what happened to him?" Parker asked. "Last I heard he got divorced, sold what his wife didn't end up with and moved to Mexico. Dude's probably down there living his best post-apocalyptic life," Hansen said. "It's a shame he didn't retire out here. We could use somebody like that, Parker said. Hanson let out a chuckle as he made the turn onto the 4-lane road that sat just outside the neighborhood. The street was wider here, with more room to maneuver. He kept the speed low and checked his mirrors to make sure the horde was still following. The massive bodies rounded the corner behind them, their pace never faltering. Once he was satisfied they had made the turn, he hit the gas again. "How far up is this apartment complex?" Hanson asked. "It's a couple blocks up on the right. We're going to drive past it, hang a right, and the interstate should be a half-mile up," Parker said. "All right, let's go add to the pack and get moving. I'd like to be home by dark," Hanson said. The two soldiers nodded as Hanson kept the speed low. The digital gauge on the dash fluctuated between 4 and 5 miles an hour, the needle bouncing slightly with each adjustment of his foot on the pedal. The zombies moved at a slightly heightened pace, faster than a normal walk, but not quite running. They never tired, though, so this speed was enough to keep them close without losing them entirely. After a minute of driving, they were approaching the apartment complex. The building rose up on their right, a 3-story structure that stretched along the block. Hanson kept his attention forward, focused on the road ahead and the mirrors that showed their followers. Parker looked over to the complex, his eyes scanning the property. What he saw made his face go pale. "Jesus Christ," Parker said. He reached down to the controls, his hands fumbling with the buttons on the stereo system. It took him a moment to find the right one, and the music cut off abruptly. The sudden silence felt wrong, like the world had been muted. He picked up a microphone from the dash, and Hanson shot him a confused look. "What the hell are you doing, Parker?" Hanson asked. Then Hanson looked over to the complex and understood. The parking lot was filled with zombies, easily a couple hundred of them. They moved through the lot in clusters, some standing still, while others wandered aimlessly. But it was the banner on the railing of the top-floor apartments that grabbed his attention and held it. The banner had been made from a white bed sheet, secured to the railing with what looked like rope or cables. Large black letters had been painted across it, the message clear and desperate. The banner read, "20 alive inside, help us." Parker clicked on the radio, bringing the microphone up to his mouth. His voice boomed out from the speakers, loud enough to carry across the parking lot. "To the people in the apartment complex, can you hear me?" Parker asked. He held his breath, his eyes fixed on the top-floor balcony. The seconds stretched out, each one feeling longer than the last. Then movement caught his eye. A few people emerged onto the balcony, waving their arms. Parker breathed a sigh of relief. "Oh, thank God," Parker said. He clicked the microphone back on, making sure his message would be heard clearly. "We see you. It's going to take a while, but we will be coming back to help you. We are working to clear the streets of these things, but it's going to take time. If you haven't already, listen to Midnight Mike's show and call into the station. He'll get you on the rescue list," Parker said. Parker kept his attention focused on the balcony, watching as the people waved in appreciation. A couple of them gave him a thumbs up, the gesture clear even from this distance. The message had been received and understood. They would have to hold on a little longer, but help was coming. Parker replaced the microphone onto the dash before cranking the music again. The speakers roared back to life, the rock anthem picking up right where it left off. The two soldiers shook their heads, the weight of what they had just seen settling over them. 20 more people, Parker said. "Let's hope that's in the building and not all crammed into one apartment," Hanson said. "Oh, I would have fought my way out of there if I had to be shacked up with 20 other people," Parker said. "Pretty sure there were more than 20 of us at the tunnels with Diesel," Hanson said. "Exactly, and I went into darkened zombie-filled tunnels to get someplace else," Parker said. Both soldiers laughed, the sound cutting through the tension. Hanson made the turn onto the next street, the bus swinging wide to accommodate the corner. They crept along slowly, the music continuing to blast from the speakers. Up ahead, the interstate ramp came into view. "Finally, let's get this herd moving out of town," Hanson said. The party bus made the turn onto the interstate, the tires rolling smoothly onto the on-ramp. The ramp descended gently to the main road, the angle gradual enough that they barely felt the change. Much to their relief, the path was mostly clear. Only a couple of wrecked cars partially blocked a lane, their frames twisted from some collision that had happened weeks ago. Hanson navigated around them with ease, the bus slipping past without issue. They got roughly a mile up the road before Hanson glanced back toward Magnus. The gladiator was still relaxed in his seat, seemingly unbothered by everything happening around them. "Hey Magnus, would you mind going up top and giving me an assessment of our fans?" Hansen asked. "Of course, Sergeant." "Parker, can you lend me a hand?" Magnus asked. Parker nodded and moved to the rear of the bus. He grabbed a stepladder that had been secured to the wall, pulling it free and setting it up beneath a hatch in the ceiling. Magnus stood and moved to the ladder, his size making the interior of the bus feel suddenly smaller. Parker held the ladder steady as the gladiator began to climb. Magnus ascended with surprising grace for a man his size. He reached the top and pushed open the hatch, the metal panel swinging upward. He lifted himself up high enough so that his head poked through, then pulled himself up a little further to get a better view. Magnus looked back, and what he saw made him pause. The horde was massive, far larger than he had anticipated. Zombies were shoulder to shoulder across the entirety of the northbound lanes of the interstate. They stretched all the way back to the on-ramp, a river of bodies that seemed to have no end. The width of them was striking, filling every available space on the road. It was difficult to see the details from this distance, but Magnus swore he could see the line of creatures still following the others down the ramp. More were joining the mass every second, drawn by the music that continued to pour from the bus. Thousands of them, if not tens of thousands. The scale was staggering, a testament to just how thoroughly the city had fallen. Magnus dropped back down into the van, pulling the hatch closed above him. He spoke with force, his voice carrying the weight of what he had witnessed. "We have the lot of them, hook, line, and sinker." Chapter 3. Several hours had passed since they first hit the interstate. The party bus crept down the road at a steady pace, the engine humming beneath them. The music had been turned down to a dull roar, no longer at the ear-splitting volume it had been earlier. It was loud enough to be heard, but not overwhelming, a steady pulse that carried across the asphalt. The horde behind them had grown large enough to be self-propelling. The ghouls at the rear continued to march forward, their bodies pressing against the ones in front of them. The pressure kept the entire line moving, a mass of bodies that flowed down the interstate like a slow-moving river. They no longer needed the full blast of music to keep them coming. Momentum had taken over. Hansen kept his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors that showed their followers. The monotony of the drive had settled in hours ago, broken only by the occasional need to navigate around abandoned vehicles. Parker sat in the passenger seat, the tablet resting on his lap as he tracked their progress. Magnus remained in the back, stretched out on one of the overstuffed seats like he was on some kind of twisted vacation. "Finally, there's the exit for Glendale," Parker said. He pointed ahead to where a green highway sign announced the upcoming exit. The letters were clear against the white background, standing out even in the fading light. Hansen extended his fist, and Parker bumped it in celebration. Hansen looked over to his left toward the west. The sun was still above the horizon, a disk of orange that hung low in the sky. The light cast long shadows across the desert landscape, painting everything in warm tones. "It's going to be close, but we just might make it home before dark," Hansen said. "Do you want me to radio the base?" Parker asked. "Yeah, get that pilot in the air because I'm about to floor it," Hansen said. Parker nodded and grabbed his radio from his belt. He adjusted the dial, tuning it to the proper channel. The device crackled slightly as he clicked it on, bringing it up to his mouth. "Come in, Nellis. Come in, Nellis. This is Big Worm. Come back," Parker said. He glanced over to Hansen as he waited for a response. The sergeant was giving him a strange look, his eyebrows raised in question. "Big Worm? Really?" Hansen asked. "I mean, we're bait, aren't we?" Parker asked. Hansen thought about it for a moment. The logic was sound, even if the name was ridiculous. He let out a laugh and shook his head. Another moment passed before the radio crackled to life, Foster's voice coming through clear despite the static. "I read you, Parker. What's your status?" Foster asked. "We just passed by the Glendale exit, and we're about ready for a pickup," Parker said. "Copy that. I'll get Melvin in the air and headed your way. It shouldn't take him long to get up to you," Foster said. Hansen motioned for the radio, and Parker handed it over. The sergeant brought it up to his own mouth, his thumb pressing the transmit button. "Hey, Cap, just have him fly over us and I'll pull this thing off to the side of the road," Hansen said. "Copy that. It'll be good to have you boys home." "We'll see you soon," Foster said. The radio went silent, and Parker clipped it back to his belt. Hansen looked toward the back of the bus, where Magnus was still stretched out on the overstuffed seats. The Gladiator looked comfortable, almost peaceful, despite everything they had been through. "Hey Magnus, hang on back there. Our ride home is on the way, and we need to put some distance between us and the horde," Hansen said. "Do what you have to do, Sergeant," Magnus said. Hansen nodded and gave one last look in the side mirror. The horde filled the view, a wall of bodies that stretched back as far as he could see. A few of them were peeling off onto the town's exit, drawn by something he couldn't identify. The rest continued forward, locked onto the bus ahead of them. "It's been fun, but it's time for us to go home," Hansen said. He hit the gas, and the party bus lurched forward. The engine roared as they picked up speed, the sudden acceleration pressing them back into their seats. In a flash, they were doing 40 down the interstate, the speedometer climbing as Hansen kept his foot down. The zombies fell behind them, left in the dust as the distance between them grew. The mood inside the vehicle shifted, turning to one of celebration. Parker reached down to the stereo controls, his fingers working the buttons until he found the track he wanted. As it started playing, he cranked the volume back up. The music blasted through the speakers, loud and triumphant. "We don't need the music anymore, Parker," Hansen said. "I know, Sarge, but this song rocks, and frankly, we need to celebrate," Parker said. Hansen was a little more reserved than his counterpart, but even he couldn't help bobbing his head to the beat. The music was infectious, the kind of song that demanded movement. They had accomplished a lot today, not only removing thousands of zombies from the city, but proving that the plan could work. This was the first step, and it had been a success. The celebration lasted several minutes as they sped down the interstate. The music filled the bus, and for a moment it was easy to forget about the world outside. Then the sound of helicopter blades cut through, the rhythmic thump, 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 audible even over the speakers. Parker turned down the music and leaned forward, looking up through the windshield. "I see him," Parker said. "Hang on, this is going to get bumpy," Hansen said. He applied the brakes, the bus slowing rapidly as he veered off to the right. The tires left the pavement and hit the packed dirt beside the road, kicking up dust as they rolled to a stop. The bus settled with a slight bounce, and Hansen gave a quick look at the mirrors to make sure there weren't any creatures nearby. The area was clear. "All right, let's move out," Hansen called out. He threw open the door and stepped down, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. Parker and Magnus followed, each of them carrying their weapons as they emerged into the open air. They stood proudly at the side of the bus, watching as the helicopter made its final approach. The chopper descended steadily, its rotors creating a wind that whipped at their clothes and sent up clouds of dust. The pilot brought it down about 50 yards from them, setting it on the desert floor with practiced ease. The rotors began to slow, the pitch of the blades dropping as the engine throttled back. The three of them picked up the pace, moving across the desert landscape toward their ride. The ground was uneven, dotted with scrub brush and small rocks that crunched beneath their boots. They reached the helicopter and pulled open the passenger door, climbing inside one after another. Once they were all in, Magnus slammed the door shut. The interior was cramped but functional, with seats that faced each other and storage compartments along the walls. Every man grabbed a headset, pulling it on so they could hear each other over the noise. The foam pads pressed against their ears, muffling the sound of the rotors to a manageable level. "Hey Magnus, good to see you, buddy," Melvin said. The pilot's voice came through clear in the headset, cheerful despite the circumstances. "Likewise, my friend," Magnus said. "Is it just the three of you?" Melvin asked. "Yes, it's just us," Magnus said. "All right, well, strap in, sit back and relax, and I hope you enjoy your flight on Air Melvin said. The pilot flipped several switches, his hands moving with confidence across the controls. The chopper began to shake as the blades picked up speed, the vibration building until the entire vehicle hummed with energy. A moment later, they lifted off the ground, the sensation of rising unmistakable. Within seconds, they were a couple hundred feet in the air, the ground falling away beneath them. "Hey Melvin, can you fly us back over the interstate? I want to see what kind of crowd we attracted today," Hansen said. "You got it, buddy. I don't want to spoil anything, but you had a hell of a day today," Melvin said. Hansen let out a smile and positioned himself by the window so he could see. Magnus moved to join him on the left side of the helicopter, while Parker moved to the right. The glass was cool against Hansen's face as he pressed close, not wanting to miss a thing. Melvin flew them south, retracing their path down the interstate. He took them a half-mile past Glendale, then hovered in the air before turning the helicopter. The maneuver gave Hansen a clear view of the road below, and what he saw made his eyes go wide. The interstate was packed with zombies, shoulder to shoulder across all the lanes. They stretched on for a mile or more, a solid mass of bodies that moved as one. The sight was staggering, the scale of it almost impossible to process. All of those creatures had been in the city, wandering the streets and threatening the survivors. Now they were here, miles from anywhere, trapped on a road that led to nothing. "You did some good work today, Sergeant," Magnus said. "We did some good work, Magnus," Hansen said. "All I did was sit back and drink water from a martini glass," Magnus said. Hansen was about to respond when Parker's voice cut through the headsets. His tone panicked in a way that made everyone's head snap up. "Oh no," Parker said. Both Magnus and Hansen looked over to Parker, who was staring out of the window on the opposite side of the helicopter. His face had gone pale, and his hand gripped the edge of the seat. "Parker, what is it?" Hansen asked. "Get over here," Parker said. Hansen and Magnus rushed over to the other side, crowding around the window. Parker pointed down to the small town below them. Glendale spread out beneath the helicopter, its streets visible in the fading light. Zombies swarmed through those streets, moving between buildings in clusters. The town was infested, overrun by the creatures that had peeled off from the main horde. "Who cares that those things left the interstate? They're away from the city, so we're good," Hansen said. "Look at the big building on the north side of town," Parker said. Hansen and Magnus adjusted their views, following Parker's pointing finger. There was a large building there, windows all around it. Suddenly, in one of those windows, something flashed. It took Hansen a moment to recognize what he was seeing, but when he did, his stomach dropped. Muzzle flashes. Someone was firing a gun from inside that building. "My God, is that what I think it is?" Magnus asked. "Survivors. At least they were before we led 1,000 of those things to their doorstep," Parker said. The weight of that statement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. They had done this. Their plan had worked exactly as intended, drawing the zombies out of the city and leading them away. But in doing so, they had brought them right through this town, right to the doorstep of people who were trying to survive. "Sergeant, what do you want me to do?" Melvin asked. Parker glared at Hansen, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. The sergeant held his gaze for a moment, then gave him a knowing nod. There was only one choice to make, even if it meant putting themselves at risk. "Find a spot to land. We're going to go save them." Chapter 4. Melvin flew the helicopter to the north side of town, the chopper banking as he adjusted course. The maneuver pressed them against their seats, the shift in momentum pulling at their bodies. The town of Glendale passed beneath them, its streets filled with the dead. Even from this height, they could see the creatures moving through the roads, dark shapes that clustered and wandered without purpose. He brought them down half a mile away from the edge of town, selecting a flat stretch of desert that offered solid ground. The helicopter descended steadily, and Melvin's hands moved across the controls with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The skids touched ground with a slight bounce, the shock absorbers compressing before the helicopter settled fully. The engine throttled back, and the vibration that had filled the cabin began to decrease. Before the men could depart, Melvin spoke into the headsets. "All right, listen up. I have enough fuel to stay in the area for an hour. I'm on Channel 12, so once you figure out where you need me, you let me know," Melvin said. "What happens if we take longer than an hour?" Magnus asked. "It means we're walking back to base," Hansen said. "We'll get this done in an hour then," Magnus said. Melvin nodded to the men as they threw open the door to the chopper. They jumped down onto the dirt, their boots hitting the ground hard as they moved away from the spinning blades. The rotor wash whipped at their clothes and sent up clouds of dust that stung their eyes. Once they were clear, Melvin sped the rotor up. The pitch increased and the helicopter lifted off, rising into the darkening sky before banking away. The sound of the helicopter faded, the rhythmic beating of the rotors growing distant until it was swallowed by the vastness of the desert. In its place came something else, something that made all three men go still. Gunshots. The sharp cracks carried across the open space. echoing off the scattered buildings at the edge of town. They were close enough now to realize that the shots were coming from two different sources. The sounds overlapped slightly, but were distinct enough to identify as separate locations, each one representing people fighting for their lives. "Jesus Christ, how many people did we screw over?" Parker asked. His voice carried a weight that went beyond the words themselves. This was their fault, at least in part. They had drawn the horde through here, inadvertently putting these survivors in danger. The guilt was already settling in. Hansen didn't respond. Instead, he listened intently to the gunshots as they popped off again. He turned his head slowly, using the sound to triangulate the positions. One source was coming from the east side of town, the other from the west. "We're helping the people on the west side first. Let's move," Hansen said. "Why the west?" Magnus asked. "Because it's further away from the interstate, so hopefully we won't have as big a crowd to deal with," Hansen said. Magnus smirked as he shifted his warhammer in his grip. The weapon's handle was stained with dried blood, and more covered the striking surface. He had put it to good use already, and he was ready to do so again. "I will thin whatever crowd there is," Magnus said. Hansen nodded as more gunshots went off in the distance. The three men took off running, moving at a pace that balanced speed with caution. They couldn't afford to sprint blindly into a situation they didn't understand, but they also couldn't waste time. The visible light was fading fast, the sky transitioning from orange to purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the ground, pooling in the low spots and making the terrain harder to read. The details of the landscape became harder to make out with each passing minute. It took a few minutes for them to reach the edge of town. The transition from desert to civilization was abrupt, marked by the appearance of paved roads and the first houses. They moved to the west as they went, angling toward the source of the gunfire that seemed most manageable. The houses here were single-story structures, typical suburban homes with small yards and attached garages. Most of them looked abandoned, their windows dark and their doors hanging open. As soon as they took up a position behind one of the houses, pressing themselves against the stucco wall, two zombies staggered out from between the structures. The creatures moved with the stiff gait that marked them as recently turned, their bodies not yet broken down by days of constant movement. Their heads swiveled as they picked up on the sound of footsteps, and they adjusted course without hesitation. Magnus went to work before either soldier could raise their rifles. He swung his warhammer across his body in a wide arc. The weapon connected with the side of the first creature's head, the impact producing a wet crunch. The skull caved in, and the zombie dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. The body hit the ground and went still. The other ghoul barely had time to react to its partner being struck down before it met the same fate. Magnus raised his weapon high and brought it down onto the top of its skull. The force of the blow drove the creature to its knees before it collapsed forward. Magnus stepped back, scanning the area for more threats. He poked his head around the corner of the house and spotted half a dozen more zombies between them and the front of the structure. They were spread out, some standing still while others wandered in small circles. Before he could relay that information, more gunshots went off. These were closer, coming from a few doors down from their current position. Hansen moved up to take point as Magnus gave him hand signals. The gladiator held up 6 fingers, then pointed around the corner. Hansen acknowledged with a nod. He looked down at the ground and grabbed a rock, testing its weight in his hand before preparing to throw. "Get ready to move. We get down to the house, lay waste to whatever is there, and get those people to safety," Hansen said. "And where is that exactly?" Parker asked. "Just get them out and get them moving to the west," Hansen said. The two others nodded as Hansen stepped out from the side of the house. He pulled his arm back and let the rock fly. It soared over the heads of the zombies before clattering to the pavement several yards away. The sound drew their attention, and all 6 of them turned toward it. As soon as their backs were turned, Hansen led the trio out. They ran across the backs of the houses, keeping low and moving fast. The gunshots grew louder as they got closer, each one a sharp crack that echoed off the buildings. Hansen held up his hand, signaling the group to stop, as they reached what he believed was the target location. He looked out toward the front of the house and felt his stomach sink. A small army of the dead crowded around the structure, pressing against the walls and clawing at the windows. He counted quickly, estimating at least 25 zombies, with more undoubtedly to the east. Every gunshot would draw more of them, creating a situation that could spiral out of control fast. "Parker, we're clearing out as many as we can, cutting right through the heart of the mob. Once we do that, you and I are going to focus on the east. Magnus, do you think you can handle the ones up against the house?" Hansen asked. Magnus didn't respond verbally. He just gave the sergeant a smirk, the kind of expression that said he had faced worse odds before. It was all Hansen needed to see. "All right, let's get it done," Hansen said. The two soldiers broke from cover, raising their rifles as they moved into the open. The transition from concealment to exposure was a calculated risk, but they had no choice. They picked their targets, focusing on the zombies in the center of the mob where the density was greatest. Hansen's finger found the trigger, and he took a breath before squeezing. His rifle barked, the sound sharp and loud in the confined space between houses. The first round caught a zombie in the back of the head, the bullet punching through skull and brain before the creature even knew it was under attack. It dropped without a sound. Parker fired a split second later, his shot just as accurate, another body falling to join the first. In a matter of seconds, bullets were flying downrange. The rhythm of their shooting was steady and controlled, each squeeze of the trigger deliberate. Each shot found its mark, punching through skulls and sending zombies crashing to the ground. Brass casings ejected from their rifles, catching what little light remained before tumbling to the pavement with metallic clinks. One by one, the bodies fell, creating a corridor through the center of the pack. The tightly packed mob began to thin as the soldiers worked through their targets with mechanical efficiency. The remaining creatures began to turn, drawn by the sound of gunfire. The shots were impossible to ignore, and their primitive brains locked onto the new source of noise. Several zombies pivoted away from the house, their vacant eyes sweeping across the yard until they found the soldiers. The creatures started moving toward them, but they were too slow. As their heads turned, Hansen and Parker were ready. They adjusted their aim and placed rounds in the middle of foreheads, dropping each one before it could take more than a step or two. The accuracy was mechanical, born from countless hours of training and practice. These were not lucky shots, but the result of muscle memory and discipline. Hansen and Parker pushed up, turning to the east and continuing to fire. They moved out of the way, creating space for Magnus to work. The gladiator rushed forward, his warhammer already in motion. He swung hard, the weapon whistling through the air before connecting with a zombie's skull. The head caved in, and Magnus let out a warrior's yell. The sound was primal, a combination of exertion and enjoyment. He was not only pumping himself up, but clearly relishing the fight. Magnus pressed forward, his boots pounding against the pavement as he closed the distance. He saw 7 zombies pressed up against the house, their bodies crowding around the structure. They clawed at the walls and windows, focused entirely on getting inside to whatever prey they sensed within. Their fingers scraped uselessly against the glass and siding, leaving smears but accomplishing nothing. Only one of them had bothered to turn in his direction, drawn by the heavy footfalls of his approach. The gladiator quickly closed the gap and brought his warhammer around in a vicious arc. The weapon connected with the side of the zombie's head, and the skull gave way with a wet crunch. The creature dropped without ceremony, its body going limp before it hit the ground. Magnus didn't pause to admire his work. He immediately went after the ones whose backs were still turned, their attention so fixated on the house that they hadn't registered the threat behind them. He swung his warhammer in a controlled frenzy, each strike destroying a creature with brutal efficiency. The weapon rose and fell in a deadly rhythm, crushing skulls and dropping bodies with each impact. Blood spattered across the front of the house and pooled on the small porch. The sound of each strike was distinct, a combination of metal meeting bone and the subsequent collapse of the body. As he worked through the creatures, he looked up through the carnage and caught a glimpse of movement in the window above. A man stood there, his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open in what could only be described as shock. The confusion on his expression was clear, even through the dirt-streaked window. He had probably never seen anything like Magnus before, let alone watch someone dispatch zombies with a warhammer. Magnus let out a big grin as he continued laying waste to the undead that had been trying to get into the house. The man in the window took a step back, his mouth hanging open. With a few more swings, Magnus finished the remaining creatures off. He stood over his vanquished foes, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. The adrenaline was still pumping, but he forced himself to calm down. His attention was pulled back to the house as he heard a small knock on the window. The sound was tentative, barely audible over the ringing in his ears from the combat. A young woman in her early 20s stood beside the older man, her hand still raised from where she had tapped the glass. She gave Magnus a slight wave, the gesture small and uncertain. The shock of what she was witnessing was clearly written on her face, her eyes wide and her skin pale. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered it, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just seen. Magnus gave her a smile and a wave as well, the expression meant to be reassuring, despite the blood that covered his weapon and speckled his arms. He started to say something, but the sound of gunshots behind him cut through the moment. Multiple shots fired in rapid succession, the reports echoing off the buildings. He stopped and glanced over his shoulder, his body tensing as he prepared for another wave. Hanson and Parker were rushing back toward him, their rifles still up and ready. The two soldiers moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the area as they closed the distance. Their magazines were getting low, visible by the way they moved with slightly more caution than before. A couple dozen bodies were scattered on the ground, stretching out in front of several houses like macabre decorations. The soldiers had done their work efficiently, clearing the immediate area with precision and speed. However, a block down, Magnus could see the real problem: more zombies, hundreds of them, shambling in their direction. They moved as one, a wall of bodies that filled the street from sidewalk to sidewalk. The creatures were drawn by the gunfire and the promise of prey, their heads all turned in the same direction. The mass of bodies filled the street, and more were joining from the side streets with each passing second. The trickle was becoming a flood, and they had minutes at best before the horde arrived. Hanson and Parker rushed over to the house, spotting the duo immediately. The man was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The woman next to him looked like she might be his daughter, though Hanson couldn't be certain. "My name is Sergeant Hanson, and we need to get you out of here right now." Chapter 5. Hanson led the others through the street to the west, his rifle up and ready. The weapon felt solid in his hands, familiar after hours of carrying it through hostile territory. The two civilians followed close behind, their footsteps quick and uneven on the pavement. Eric kept one hand on his daughter's shoulder, guiding her as they moved. The man's other hand clutched a handgun, the grip white-knuckled. The group stayed tight, nobody wanting to be the one who fell behind and became separated from the others. He kept his focus forward, his eyes scanning the shadows between houses and the dark spaces where the streetlights no longer worked. Every corner was a potential threat, every alley a place where zombies could emerge from the darkness. The neighborhood was quiet except for their footsteps and breathing, an eerie calm that felt wrong after the chaos of the rescue. His finger rested alongside the trigger guard, ready to move into position the instant a threat appeared. They moved up a block, the houses giving way to slightly larger structures. Two zombies shambled out from behind one of them, their silhouettes breaking from the darkness. The creatures moved with that distinctive gait, stiff and awkward, but relentless. Hanson raised his hand, signaling everyone to stop. He glanced behind them, checking on the pursuit. Only about a third of the zombies that had been chasing them were continuing to do so. The rest had either lost interest or been distracted by something else. It was a small mercy, but one they would take. The creatures that remained were spread out, not yet formed into a concentrated threat. "Magnus, do your thing," Hanson said. The gladiator nodded and marched forward, his warhammer already in motion. He covered the distance quickly, his boots making almost no sound despite his size. The first zombie turned toward him, but Magnus was faster. The warhammer came around in a tight arc, catching the creature in the temple. The skull caved in with a muted crunch, and the zombie dropped. The second one barely registered what had happened before it met the same fate. Magnus worked silently, efficiently, dispatching both threats without the need for gunfire that would draw more attention. As Magnus worked, Hanson looked back to the civilians. They were both breathing hard, their faces flushed from the run. The woman, Andrea, had her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth. Her father stood close to her, his posture protective. "What's your name?" Hanson asked. "I'm Eric, and this is my daughter Andrea," Eric said. Hanson nodded at the two of them, the gesture meant to acknowledge the introduction. There wasn't time for pleasantries, but names mattered. They weren't just civilians anymore. They were Eric and Andrea, people with identities. "We need a place to lie low until our ride can get back to us," Hansen said. Before Eric could answer, gunshots went off in the direction they had come from. The sound was distant but unmistakable, sharp cracks that echoed off the buildings. Everyone's head turned toward the source. "We have to get to the others," Andrea said. Her voice carried an urgency that bordered on panic. Parker stepped forward, his expression sympathetic but realistic. "With as many of those things that are out there, we may not be able to," Parker said. "I'm not leaving them behind," Andrea said. Her voice rose, and Hansen was forced to step between them. "Hey, cut it. We can talk about it when we're not standing in the middle of the street. Now, where can we go?" Hansen asked. Eric looked around, getting his bearings before pointing down the street. "There's a little garage the next block over with a fence around it. Will that do?" Eric asked. "Yeah, that will work just fine," Hansen said. Hansen turned to get Magnus's attention, but the gladiator was already walking back to them. The creatures behind him were on the ground motionless, dark shapes that no longer posed a threat. His warhammer dripped with crimson, the blood pooling on the pavement. "Problem solved," Magnus said. "Come on, we're moving," Hansen said. Magnus nodded, falling into step as Hansen led them out. They ran hard through the streets, their boots pounding against the asphalt. The sound seemed loud in the quiet neighborhood, but there was no helping it. Speed mattered more than stealth right now. They made the turn at the next intersection, racing toward their makeshift sanctuary. On the corner of the next block sat the small fenced-in mechanic's garage. There was only one bay, and the roll-up door was partially closed, leaving a gap of about 2 feet at the bottom. The fence around the property was chain link, about 6 feet high, with a gate that swung inward. Weeds had grown up through the gravel lot, and an old tire leaner against the fence near the corner. It wasn't much in the way of fortifications, but it was more than enough for their current predicament. The fence would slow anything down, and the building itself offered solid walls and limited entry points. Hansen led them through the gate, his rifle sweeping the yard as they entered. An old sedan sat parked to one side, its tires flat and windows dusty. Parker stayed behind to pull the gate closed, the metal rattling as he worked the latch to secure it. The others moved up to the building, their steps cautious now that they had some measure of protection. Hansen motioned for Magnus to go ahead, and the big gladiator dropped to the ground. He rolled underneath the partially open bay door, his body disappearing into the darkness beyond. There was a moment of silence, then movement inside. Magnus swept the garage area quickly, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The space was small but functional, with a single lift in the center and toolboxes lining the walls. A car sat on the lift, suspended in the air, its undercarriage exposed. The place smelled of oil and rubber. He checked the corners, the back office, everywhere something could hide. The garage was empty. With a yank on a nearby chain, the door began to rise. The mechanism rattled as the door rolled up, revealing the interior fully. "We're clear in here," Magnus said. Everybody filed into the garage, moving quickly from the exposed yard into the relative safety of the building. Magnus pulled the door down right after Parker got inside, the metal settling into place with a solid thunk. They were enclosed now, cut off from the outside world. Parker moved to a workbench and found a small light meant to illuminate under the hood of a car. He clicked it on, and a cone of yellow light spread across the concrete floor. It was enough to see by without advertising their position to everything outside. They didn't want to fully light the shop and turn themselves into a beacon. "Magnus, keep a watch on the roads. Let me know if any of those things followed us here," Hansen said. The gladiator nodded and moved into the waiting room area of the garage. The space was small, with a few plastic chairs and a coffee table covered in old magazines. Large windows looked out toward the streets, offering a clear view of the surrounding area. Magnus took a knee in the shadows, positioning himself where he could see without being seen. His warhammer rested against his shoulder, ready to be deployed if needed. Meanwhile, the others stayed in the garage bay. Hansen leaned against the workbench, his rifle lowered, but still in his hands. Parker stood near the door, his posture alert. Eric and Andrea moved to the far wall, putting some distance between themselves and the soldiers. "First off, are the two of you all right?" Hansen asked. "Yeah, we're fine. We're just confused. I mean, where in the hell did all those things come from?" Eric asked. His voice carried frustration and exhaustion in equal measure. The question hung in the air, and Parker and Hansen exchanged a look. Neither man wanted to claim responsibility for what had happened, but their expressions said everything. The guilt was visible, written in the way their eyes dropped and their jaws tightened. They had done this, however, unintentionally. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy on both of them. Eric and Andrea noticed the exchange, the silent admission that passed between the two soldiers. "It's your fault, isn't it?" Andrea asked. The accusation was direct, her voice sharp. Parker and Hansen continued looking guilty. They dropped their heads and nodded, confirming what she already suspected. There was no point in denying it or trying to explain it away. "Why? Why would you do that to us?" Andrea asked. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, emotion breaking through. Parker stepped forward, wanting to offer some kind of explanation or apology. "I assure you that it wasn't intentional," Parker said. Andrea's voice rose, taking on a mocking tone that cut through the garage like a blade. "Oh, it wasn't intentional? Well, that makes it okay then," Andrea said. The sarcasm was thick, and her anger was building rather than fading. Eric put his hand on his daughter's shoulder, applying gentle pressure. The touch was meant to ground her, to remind her that losing control wouldn't help anything. She took a breath and stepped back, but the anger in her eyes didn't fade. It simmered there, barely contained. "I think what my daughter is trying to say is, a little heads up would have been nice. We've been handling stragglers since all this began, but a few hundred of them at the same time is a bit much," Eric said. "Thousands," Parker said. He spoke under his breath, but the word carried in the enclosed space. Eric's head snapped up. "I'm sorry, did you say thousands?" Eric asked. "Yeah, but if it's any consolation, I'm pretty sure most of them stayed on the interstate," Parker said. Andrea's eyes filled with rage. The emotion simmered there, even as her dad tried to calm her down, his hand still on her shoulder. "I'd like to think you had a good reason to do that, but for the life of me, I can't think of one at the moment," Eric said. "We're working to clear out the city so that we can secure it," Hansen said. "You want some friendly advice? Let people in harm's way know that you're sending a small army their way," Eric said. "Believe me, it will be the first thing I bring up at the debrief. But first things first, we have to get out of here," Hansen said. Hansen reached to his belt to grab the radio, but Andrea cut him off before he could click it on. "What about the others?" Andrea asked. Hansen put down the radio. He turned his full attention to her, recognizing that this conversation needed to happen before they could move forward. "Where are they?" Hansen asked. "There's a restaurant a quarter-mile off the interstate. It's been reinforced and has wind chimes set up to draw the stragglers over to it," Eric said. "How many people?" Parker asked. "No more than 5, Eric said. "What about anybody else in town?" Parker asked. "It's just us and them. Everybody moved down to Glendale to the southeast of here once we got a handle on things. We keep the station here in town, manned to prevent any of those things from wandering down there," Eric said. "Christ, how many people did we put in danger down there?" Parker asked. "There's about 150 down there, but don't worry, they're pretty far off the interstate, so they should be all right," Eric said. "We can worry about them later. Right now, we need to figure out how we're getting to the others." "I don't suppose you have a vehicle, do you?" Hansen asked. "It's parked at the restaurant," Eric said. "Maybe we could find a car that was left behind?" Parker asked. He was grasping at straws, trying to find any solution that didn't involve walking through a horde on foot. Hansen shook his head, his expression skeptical. "Do you really think a car is going to be able to push through a horde that size?" Hansen asked. It was a fair question. A sedan or SUV might handle a few zombies, but hundreds? The weight would stop them, or worse, pull them under the vehicle where the creatures could tear into the undercarriage. Parker's shoulders sagged slightly, acknowledging the point. "Probably not, but it has a better chance than we do on foot," Parker said. Andrea stepped forward, her expression thoughtful rather than angry now. The shift was sudden, as if a different part of her brain had taken over. She was problem-solving instead of venting. "What about a school bus? Could that work?" Andrea asked. Hansen's head turned toward her, considering the suggestion. "It depends. Do we have access to a school bus?" Hansen asked. Eric shook his head, already running through the local resources in his mind. "Just the elementary school, and they don't have a bus. The middle and high schools are all down in Glendale," Eric said. Andrea's face lit up slightly, a memory surfacing that might change everything. Yeah, but the bus driver lives here, and they let him take the bus home at night since he would pick up the kids who lived here. At least he did a couple years ago when I caught the bus, Andrea said. Hanson looked over to Parker. The private gave a half-hearted shrug, the gesture suggesting it might work but offering no guarantees. It was a gamble, but it was better than nothing. Where do they live? Hanson asked. About 6 blocks from the restaurant, but it's 3 blocks off the main road, Andrea said. It might be doable, Parker said. It's the best idea we have, Hanson said. He trailed off as he checked his watch. The numbers glowed in the dim light, showing how much time they had left. And it's the only one we have time for. Okay, let's go back to school. Chapter 6. Hanson led the group through the darkened streets of the small town, sticking to the last row of houses that bordered the more open areas. The structures provided cover and concealment, 2 things they desperately needed. They kept to the shadows, moving as a single unit with their footsteps muted against the pavement. Private Parker brought up the rear, his rifle sweeping back and forth as he kept an eye on the civilians. Eric and Andrea stayed in the middle, their breathing audible but controlled. The darkness was near complete now, with only the faint glow of the moon providing any illumination. Houses sat dark on either side, their windows like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. The occasional car remained parked in driveways, abandoned in the rush to evacuate or left behind when their owners never made it out. As they approached the next house, Eric tapped Hanson on the shoulder. The contact was light but insistent, getting the sergeant to stop. Hanson raised his fist, signaling everyone to halt. Eric motioned for them to go inside, pointing at the structure. The sergeant led them to the back door, his rifle up as he approached. He reached down and turned the knob, finding it unlocked. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Hanson clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust particles that hung in the air. He moved inside quickly, sweeping the light across the interior as he cleared the small 1-bedroom house. The place was sparse with minimal furniture and a thin layer of dust on every surface. A couch sat against one wall, a small television on a stand across from it. The kitchen was tiny, just a few cabinets and a narrow counter. The bedroom was even smaller, barely large enough for a bed and dresser. Once Hanson realized it was empty, he turned to the others and waved them inside. "Are we close?" Hanson asked. Eric nodded as he moved over to the front window. He reached up and pulled back the curtains just enough for him to look out, creating a narrow gap that wouldn't be visible from the outside. He studied the landscape for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the darkness outside. Then he spotted it. "There, up about 100 yards on the right," Eric said. Hanson and Parker moved to the window, positioning themselves on either side of Eric. They looked through the gap, taking a moment to locate the house in question. It was a small structure, sitting in a massive dirt lot that seemed to stretch on forever. The property had probably been intended for something larger, but only the small house had ever been built. On the far side of the building sat the school bus, its yellow paint visible even in the low light. However, the bus wasn't alone. About 40 zombies wandered around the yard and street, their movements slow and aimless. Some clustered near the house, while others drifted toward the bus. A few stood perfectly still, as if waiting for some signal to move. "I don't suppose you know where the keys are, do you?" Hanson asked. "I know for a fact that they're not in the bus," Eric said. "How do you know that?" Andrea asked. "Because when I was in school, the bus driver made that mistake and had to hitchhike to the strip to pick it up," Eric said. Andrea gave her father a curious look, one eyebrow raised. Eric responded with a smirk and a shrug, the expression almost playful despite their circumstances. "Don't look so surprised that your dad had a life before you came along," Eric said. Andrea's eyes went wide, and the others let out some laughs. The moment of levity was brief but welcome, a reminder that they were still human despite everything. After a moment, Hanson got them back on task. "So, we need to look in the house," Hanson said. "Wait, what if he took the keys with him when everybody evacuated?" Parker asked. Andrea and Eric got a little somber, the humor draining from their faces. Eric's expression shifted, and he looked down before speaking. He was sick at the start of this. "I don't think he'd live past the first day," Eric said. "Sorry, but I had to ask," Parker said. "Don't worry about it," Andrea said. "Okay, how do we want to play this?" Hanson asked. Parker leaned closer to the window, studying the distribution of the zombies. They were spread out but not evenly, with clusters forming in certain areas while others remained relatively clear. "I don't think a diversion is going to work," Parker said. He paused, then continued. "If the gunshots coming from the restaurant hasn't pulled them away, I don't think we're going to have much luck," Parker said. "Plus, we'd run the risk of pulling more of them in our direction," Hansen said. Magnus stepped forward, his warhammer shifting in his grip. The weapon was an extension of him now, so familiar that he barely seemed to notice its weight. "I can thin them out, but I'm going to need help," Magnus said. Hansen thought about it for a moment. His jaw worked as he ran through the possibilities, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Finally, he nodded, as if he was coming to terms with what needed to be done. "Okay, I'll fight alongside you while Parker goes through the house," Hansen said. Eric stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of protest. "You know we're capable of looking through the house, right?" Eric asked. "I don't want to put you in danger," Hansen said. Andrea's voice cut through, sharp and unforgiving. "Then you should have thought of that before you brought all those things to our doorstep," Andrea said. Hansen and Parker glanced at each other. The guilt was still there, visible in their expressions. They nodded in agreement, acknowledging the point she was making. "You said we're on a timer, right? Well, put us to work," Andrea said. Hansen began nodding, the decision made. They didn't have time to argue, and Andrea was right. They needed to move fast, and that meant using every available person. "Okay, the three of us will hold the line while you find the keys," Hansen said. The group nodded as Hansen and Parker drew their knives. The blades slid from their sheaths with soft, metallic whispers. Eric gave his daughter a look, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. Then he wrapped his arm around her shoulder and pulled her close, giving her a kiss on the top of the head. The gesture was tender, paternal, a father protecting his child. He adjusted the strap on his assault rifle, making sure it was secure on his shoulder. Hansen led the group to the front door. He placed his hand on the knob, but hesitated before opening, taking one last moment to prepare himself for what was coming. "Let's get this done," Hansen said. Hansen pulled open the door, leading the charge out of the house. The night air hit them as they emerged, cool against their skin. Parker and Magnus got shoulder to shoulder with the sergeant as they sprinted toward the battlefield ahead. Their boots pounded against the ground, eating up the distance. They spread out as they ran, making sure they were out of arm's reach of one another. Magnus locked onto a target first. He rushed forward, building momentum as he closed the distance. He lowered his shoulder and plowed it into the creature with the force of a battering ram. The zombie went airborne for a split second before landing hard on the ground, the impact driving the air from its lungs in a sound that was more groan than breath. As soon as the ghoul hit the dirt, Magnus raised his warhammer high and delivered a killing blow directly to its head. The skull caved in, and the creature went still. Parker and Hansen picked their first targets, moving with synchronized efficiency born from training. They stepped up and delivered forceful knife strikes to the heads, their blades angled upward to punch through the thinner bone at the temple. The knives slipped in clean, piercing the brains and ending the threat. As the bodies hit the ground, the noise they made attracted the attention of other nearby creatures. Heads began to turn, vacant eyes locking onto the new sources of movement. "Magnus, escort them to the house. We'll keep their attention this way," Hansen said. The gladiator nodded and put himself between the civilians and the zombies. He rushed ahead, getting a few steps in front of Eric and Andrea so that he could deal with a zombie that blocked their path. A forceful strike later, and the way was clear. They continued on, moving as fast as they dared without making unnecessary noise. It took a few moments for them to reach the back door of the house. The structure loomed above them, dark and silent. Eric reached down and tried the knob, twisting it hard. It didn't budge. He muttered curses under his breath, his frustration evident. "We're going to have to go to the front of the house," Eric said. Eric backed up, preparing to turn toward the front. Before he could take a step, however, Magnus swung his warhammer hard. The weapon connected with the door right at the knob, and the wooden frame snapped like a twig. The lock mechanism shattered, and the door rattled open, swinging inward on its hinges. "Don't take too long," Magnus said. Magnus didn't wait for a response. Instead, he let out a warrior's scream, the sound primal and fierce. Then he ran toward the front of the house, where Hansen and Parker were engaged with multiple zombies. The The two civilians watched as the gladiator delivered a front kick to a zombie near the corner of the house. The creature stumbled backward, and before it could recover, Magnus crushed its skull with a hammer strike. Blood sprayed across the siding. "Come on, we have to find those keys," Eric said. Father and daughter rushed into the house, their hands reaching for light switches. They hit the lights with each new room they entered, flooding the spaces with harsh fluorescent illumination. They checked every counter, every tabletop surface, their eyes scanning for the distinctive shape of keys. The kitchen yielded nothing. The living room was equally barren. Frustration began to build as they came up empty again and again. Eric moved to the back bedroom, his hand reaching for the door. He threw it open and immediately recoiled, repulsed by what he saw. There was no body, but dried brains were splattered on the wall in a dark stain that had turned almost black. The pattern told a story he didn't want to think about. He hadn't been part of the quarantine squad for the town, but he had heard stories of how grisly that job had been. This confirmed that what he had heard was true. He shook off the image, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He looked around the room, his eyes sweeping across the surfaces. Then he spotted them. The keys sat on the side table, next to a lamp and a half-empty glass of water. "I got them! Meet me by the front door," Eric called out. Eric grabbed the keys and moved quickly through the house, his footsteps loud in the confined space. He reached the front and spotted his daughter standing beside the door. She held a set of keys in her hand, looking uncertain. "I don't know which is which," Andrea said. "Let's just hope one of them is right," Eric said. Eric reached down for the door handle, wrapping his fingers around it. He pulled it open, and the scene outside hit him like a physical blow. A massive battle was taking place in the yard. The two soldiers and gladiator were engaged with a small army of the dead, their movements a blur of strikes and dodges. Dozens of creatures shambled in their direction, drawn by the noise and movement. Another dozen bodies littered the ground at their feet, testament to the work they had already done. "We got the keys!" Eric shouted. Hansen glanced back over his shoulder, spotting them in the doorway. In a flash, he sheathed his knife, the blade disappearing into its holder. He slung his rifle around to the ready position, the weapon coming up smooth and fast. "Light them up and get to the bus," Hansen called out. Parker did as instructed, joining the sergeant in readying his weapon. They opened fire, the muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. The reports were deafening, echoing off the house and surrounding structures. They cut down half a dozen zombies in a matter of seconds, the bodies dropping as rounds found their marks. The path to the bus opened up, clear for the moment. The entire group ran hard, boots pounding against the dirt. The two soldiers took up a position beside the bus door, their backs to the vehicle as they faced outward. They popped off the occasional shot, single rounds aimed carefully to prevent creatures from getting too close. Eric got behind the wheel of the bus, his hands fumbling with the keys. He tried one, then another, muttering under his breath. The third key slid into the ignition, and he turned it hard. The engine whined for a moment, the sound high-pitched and concerning. Then it caught, rumbling to life with a diesel growl. As the bus idled, he yelled out through the open door. "It started! Get on board!" Eric called out. Parker and Hansen did as instructed, backing up the steps while keeping their rifles pointed outward. Eric's hand slammed down on the lever that closed the door, and it swung shut with a pneumatic hiss. As soon as they were safely aboard, he threw the bus into gear. His foot hit the gas, and the vehicle lurched forward. They bounced over the desert landscape, the suspension working hard as Eric navigated toward the back road. Dust kicked up behind them, obscuring their wake. He made the turn to the west, the bus leaning slightly as it took the corner. He sped up, the speedometer climbing as they put distance between themselves and the zombies. Several blocks passed before he finally eased off the gas and brought them to a stop. He checked the mirrors, looking back at the road behind them. The zombies were firmly in their rear view, too far back to be a threat. He threw the bus into park and turned in his seat, letting out a sigh of relief. "Well, that was fun," Eric said. "That's some good work finding the keys," Hansen said. "We told you that we were useful," Andrea said. "And I believe it. Now we just need to go save your friends." Chapter 7. Eric sat behind the wheel of the school bus as it idled in the middle of the street. The engine rumbled beneath them, a steady vibration that traveled through the floor and up through the seats. They were positioned a few blocks off the main road through town, as well as a few blocks from the restaurant where the others waited. In the darkness, they could see creatures shambling toward them, their silhouettes moving against the slightly lighter sky. The numbers were limited, though, just a handful rather than the massive horde they had encountered before. "So, what's the plan?" Eric asked. Hansen stood near the front of the bus, one hand gripping the metal rail that ran along the ceiling. He thought about it for a moment, his jaw working as he considered their options. Finally, he shook his head, acknowledging that they didn't have many choices. "We drive right up to the front door, and we help them fight their way out," Hansen said. "Do you think that's going to work?" Parker asked. "I think I don't have another idea, and we have about 20 minutes before we have to be heading out of town, or else Melvin is going to leave us behind," Hansen said. "Good enough for me. Magnus, you in?" Parker asked. The gladiator shifted his warhammer, the weapon resting comfortably on his shoulder. His expression was calm, almost eager. "Just point me and my warhammer in the right direction," Magnus said. "Great, Eric, take us to your people," Hansen said. Eric nodded and hit the gas. The bus lurched forward, picking up speed as they moved up the street. He made a turn at the next intersection, the bus leaning slightly as it took the corner. They were heading back toward the main road, back toward the heart of the problem. As they drove, Andrea looked at Magnus with a curious expression. Her eyes traveled over the gladiator gear, taking in the armor and the weapons. The outfit was so out of place in the current world that it demanded attention. It didn't take long for Magnus to notice her staring. "If you wish to ask questions, I encourage you to do so," Magnus said. "Okay then, what's up with the gladiator outfit?" Andrea asked. "My friends and I were performers at the Coliseum Dinner Theater, and we loved every moment of it. When the zombie apocalypse began, we decided to live our best life," Magnus said. Andrea's expression shifted to something like understanding. The logic was sound in its own way, a choice to embrace something meaningful rather than just surviving. "Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Almost makes me wish I had a fantasy job I could lean into," Andrea said. "It is never too late to embrace your inner gladiator," Magnus said. Andrea let out a laugh, the sound genuine despite their circumstances. Magnus smiled in response, pleased to have lightened the mood even briefly. The moment was cut short as Eric made the turn onto the main road. His voice carried a note of warning. "Everybody hang on, this is going to be a bumpy ride," Eric said. The passengers gripped their seats tightly, their hands wrapping around the metal frames. The bus shuddered as it made contact with the first zombie, the impact traveling through the frame. More bodies hit the front grille, the sound of flesh and bone against metal filling the air. Bodies flew through the air as the bus cut its way down the street, launched by the force of impact. Some went tumbling across the pavement, while others were pushed to the side. Eric's instinct was to go fast, to power through the horde with speed and momentum. But Hansen put his hand on his shoulder, the touch firm but not rough. "I know it sounds counterintuitive, but you need to slow down," Hansen said. Eric understood the reasoning. Too much speed and they might get stuck on bodies, or worse, pull something under the bus where it could damage the undercarriage. He let off the gas, bringing their speed down. They kept pushing through the horde as it grew thicker and thicker, the density of creatures increasing with each block. Eventually, they got the restaurant in sight, and what they saw made everyone go silent. "Jesus Christ," Parker said. There were hundreds of zombies swarming the restaurant. The building itself was barely visible through the mass of bodies, which pressed against every wall and window. It was difficult to even see the front door, let alone imagine a path to get to it. The creatures moved as one, a wall of flesh that surrounded the structure completely. They stopped half a block up, and almost immediately creatures began swarming the bus. Their decaying hands smacked against the metal sides, leaving smears and streaks. The sound was rhythmic, almost musical in its repetition. Faces pressed against the windows, their vacant eyes staring in at the passengers. "How in the hell are we doing this?" Eric asked. Hansen stared at the situation, his mind racing through possibilities. He tried to come up with a plan, but nothing seemed viable. Every option led to the same problem: too many zombies and not enough time. "I have no clue, but I'm open to ideas," Hansen said. "Can they get onto the roof?" Magnus asked. Eric shook his head, his expression showing that he had already considered that option. "No, the ladder's on the outside," Eric said. Andrea's eyes went wide as something clicked in her mind. She got up from her seat and rushed to the front of the bus, nearly stumbling as the vehicle rocked from the impacts against its sides. "But we can get them to the ladder," Andrea said. "There's no way," Parker said. "There is. Dad, drive around to the back of the building," Andrea said. The soldiers shared a glance, uncertainty written on their faces. They turned to Eric, waiting to see what the driver would do. After a moment, Eric nodded. He trusted his daughter's instincts, had seen her solve problems before. "Okay, I'll get us back there," Eric said. Eric gently pressed on the gas, and the bus began to move. They pushed through the horde of undead slowly, the creatures parting reluctantly as the vehicle forced its way through. He made the turn into the driveway, the bus bouncing slightly as it left the street. They moved slowly across the lot, navigating around abandoned cars and debris. "Hit the horn to get their attention," Andrea said. Eric did as instructed, his palm coming down on the center of the steering wheel. The horn blared, loud and jarring in the relative quiet. Andrea got up against the window, pressing her face close to the glass. Within moments, she could see people inside looking out. They appeared at the windows, their faces tight with fear and confusion. She frantically used hand signals, pointing first to the back of the building, then making a climbing motion with her hands. She gestured upward repeatedly, trying to communicate the plan without words. The people inside the restaurant were confused at first, their expressions showing that they didn't understand. But Andrea kept signaling, her movements exaggerated and clear. Finally, they nodded in agreement, understanding dawning on their faces. "Okay, they know what the plan is," Andrea said. "That's good, but would you mind sharing with the rest of us?" Parker asked. Andrea held up a finger, getting them to wait. Her father pulled the bus around to the back of the building, navigating carefully through the parking lot. She pointed to the ladder, which was mounted on the wall right beside the back door. The distance between door and ladder was not more than 5 feet, easily manageable under normal circumstances. But zombies swarmed the door, crowding the area and eliminating any safe path. "Dad, pull over to the far back of the parking lot. We need to give those things some room to move," Andrea said. Eric nodded, understanding the strategy. He backed the bus up, the transmission whining as he threw it into reverse. Then he pulled it forward to the far end of the parking lot, positioning them at the opposite corner from the door. He threw the bus into park as a handful of zombies shambled toward them. Most of the pack stayed by the door, their attention fixed on the building and the prey they knew was inside. "It's going to be tight, but if we can fire off a few shots, I think we can pull them far enough away from the door for the others to slip out and get up the ladder," Andrea said. The soldiers shared a glance. Parker shrugged, and Hansen nodded. The plan was risky, but it had a chance of working. "We've survived flimsier plans," Parker said. "Parker, get on the roof and cover them at the door. I'll take some shots through the window," Hansen said. Andrea pulled out a handgun from her waistband, checking the magazine before nodding. She moved over to a window, positioning herself for a clear line of sight. "Magnus, give me a boost," Parker said. The gladiator nodded and moved to the center of the bus, positioning himself under the emergency hatch. Parker climbed onto one of the seats, then stepped onto Magnus's interlocked hands. The big man lifted with ease, and Parker pushed the hatch open. He pulled himself through, his legs disappearing as he climbed onto the roof. A moment later, his voice came from above. "In position," Parker called down. Hansen and Andrea opened fire almost simultaneously. The reports were sharp and loud inside the confined space of the bus, making everyone's ears ring. They shot a few zombies that were near the bus, dropping them with headshots. In an instant, every zombie in the area turned to focus on the source of the noise. The creatures shambled away from the building, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They moved as a group, creating space near the door. The gap wasn't large, maybe 10 feet, but it was enough. As the diversion continued to work, the back door of the restaurant finally opened. It moved slowly, just a crack at first. Then a person slipped out, moving fast and low. They grabbed onto the ladder and began ascending quickly, their hands and feet finding the rungs with practiced ease. The next person followed within seconds, and another a few moments after that. The fourth person out the door, however, didn't have their rifle secured properly. The weapon hung loose on its sling, bouncing against their body as they moved. When they grabbed the ladder, the metal barrel clanged against the rungs. The sound rang out, sharp and metallic. This drew the attention of several zombies at the back of the pack, who turned and shambled back toward the building. "Don't worry, I got you," Parker said. His voice came from above, calm and focused. He took aim from his position on the roof, his rifle steady despite the awkward stance. He squeezed off shots, the rhythm steady and controlled. One by one, he landed headshots, the zombies dropping before they could reach the ladder. This bought the last person inside precious time to escape. They emerged from the door and grabbed the ladder, climbing as fast as their limbs would allow. Once they were out of arm's reach of the zombies, safe at the higher rungs, Parker leaned his head back in through the opening. "They're on the roof! Let's move!" Parker called down. He held on tight as Eric hit the gas. The bus lurched forward, tires squealing as they accelerated. Eric drove it across the parking lot, heading directly for the side of the restaurant. He stopped a few yards away from the edge of the building, close enough that the gap was manageable, but far enough to avoid contact with the wall. The distance was maybe 6 feet, jumpable for anyone with decent athletic ability. Parker remained on the roof, extending his hand to help the survivors manage the jump. The first person took a running start and leaped, landing on the bus roof with a solid thump. Parker grabbed their arm to steady them, then guided them to the emergency hatch. In a matter of moments, they were all over, one after another, making the jump successfully. They slid in through the emergency hatch into the relative safety of the bus, landing on seats or steadying themselves on the metal rails. Once Parker dropped back inside, closing the hatch behind him, he yelled out to the front. "We're in, get us the hell out of here," Parker said. Eric hit the gas hard, and the bus surged forward. They pushed their way through the horde of ghouls, the vehicle rocking with each impact. Bodies bounced off the grill and sides, some going under the wheels with sickening crunches. "Where am I going?" Eric asked. "Just get us north of the town. I'll make sure our ride is there," Hansen said. Hansen pulled out the radio from his belt as Eric continued the drive. He brought it up to his mouth and clicked the transmit button, hoping Melvin was monitoring the channel. "Melvin, it's Hansen. We're in the clear and headed to the north," Hansen said. The radio crackled for a moment, then Melvin's voice came through clear and steady. "Copy that, Sergeant. I'll be on your position in 5. Chapter 8. Sergeant Hansen, Private Parker, and Magnus sat around a table in the mess hall at Nellis. The space was large and utilitarian, with rows of long tables and benches that could seat hundreds. Fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, their harsh white glow doing nothing to make the space feel warm or inviting. The walls were painted a neutral beige, unmarked except for a few safety posters and a large board displaying the week's menu. Right now, though, the hall was relatively quiet, occupied by only a handful of people scattered throughout. The dinner rush had passed an hour ago, leaving behind the stragglers and late arrivals. In front of them sat plates of hot food that all 3 of them were diving into with enthusiasm born from a long day and hard-earned hunger. The steam rose from their plates, carrying the smell of cooked meat and seasoned vegetables. After the chaos of Glendale, after the running and shooting and narrow escapes, this simple meal felt like luxury. The meal was simple but substantial. Some kind of meat that was probably chicken but could have been anything, mashed potatoes with gravy, and vegetables that had been prepared in bulk but still managed to taste decent. The portions were generous, piled high on the standard issue plates. After hours of running on adrenaline and nothing else, after burning through every reserve their bodies had, it was exactly what they needed. Magnus ate with the same gusto he brought to combat, his fork moving between plate and mouth with mechanical efficiency. Parker and Hansen worked through their portions at a more measured pace, savoring the first real food they had had since breakfast. As they feasted, they heard the door to the mess hall open. The sound of hinges and footsteps made all 3 of them turn to look. Captain Foster walked in with Eric and Andrea following behind him. The captain's stride was confident, and he wore a slight smile that suggested good news, or at least the absence of bad news. "Hey, pull up a seat. The food isn't half bad today," Hansen said. Andrea looked over to the captain, uncertainty crossing her features. She wasn't sure if the invitation extended to her, or if this was a military-only space. Foster caught her glance and gave the young woman a nod. "Please, help yourself. There's plenty to go around," Foster said. As Andrea walked off toward the serving line, her father called out to her. His voice carried across the space. loud enough to be heard, but not shouting. "Please get me a plate too, honey. I'm going to talk with them for a minute," Eric said. Andrea nodded and grabbed a tray from the stack near the entrance. She made her way to the back of the building, where the serving line was set up, disappearing from view behind the partition that separated the dining area from the kitchen. Foster led Eric over to the table where the others sat. He motioned for the man to sit down, pulling out a chair for him. Eric took the seat, settling in and glancing at the plates in front of the others. The food looked good, better than what they had been eating in Glendale. "So, what do you think of our little operation here, Eric?" Parker asked. He gestured around the mess hall with his fork, the gesture encompassing not just the building, but the entire base. "Not too bad, all things considered, but still, I'm kind of anxious to get back home," Eric said. Parker and Hansen looked at him in a confused manner. They exchanged a glance, their eyebrows raised in silent communication. Then both turned their attention back to Eric. The statement didn't make sense given what they had just been through. The man had nearly died multiple times in the span of a few hours, and now he wanted to go back. "You're not staying here?" Hansen asked. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, forgotten, as he processed what Eric had just said. The base offered safety, food, shelter, and community. Everything a survivor could want. Why would anyone choose to leave? "We're staying the night, but first thing in the morning, we're headed back to town," Eric said. "You know we just lured 10,000 of those things out your way, right?" Parker asked. His tone carried disbelief. He set his fork down entirely, giving Eric his full attention. "I do, but our defenses are solid enough. At least for the time being," Eric said. Foster leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. His expression was serious, but understanding. "I'm not sending them home empty-handed. I'm loaning him a few people that can help reinforce their defenses," Foster said. "Still, that's risky as hell, isn't it?" Hansen asked. "Especially since this run was the first of many. By the time we're done, there's going to be a couple million of those things roaming around out there," Parker said. The number hung in the air, staggering in its implications. A couple million zombies, all drawn away from the city, but wandering the surrounding areas. The thought was sobering. "And I'll have my people ready to move well before then," Eric said. His voice carried confidence, the tone of someone who had already thought through the risks and made his decision. Foster nodded in agreement, backing up Eric's assessment. "We have enough on our hands without relocating a couple hundred people," Foster said. He paused, then continued. "We're going to limit the operations up there for the moment while they get prepared to move," Foster said. "That's probably for the best, especially since we have a lot of people closer to home that would appreciate being relocated," Parker said. "Tell me about it. Seems like every hour Mike is calling me with another group of people who need our help," Foster said. The exhaustion in his voice was clear. The responsibility of coordinating rescues across an entire city was taking its toll, even on someone as capable as Foster. "If you need some extra hands, Captain, I'm more than happy to stay for a few days. I'm sure some of the others would as well," Eric said. Foster shook his head, but his expression was gracious. The offer was appreciated even if it couldn't be accepted. "I appreciate the offer, Eric, but I don't think it would move the needle all that much. We have a bottleneck when it comes to weapons and machinery, so we're moving as fast as we possibly can. You're going to be doing more good back home than you are here," Foster said. "But there may be something you can help with, though," Hansen said. Eric leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. If there was a way he could contribute, he wanted to hear it. "Just name it," Eric said. "Do you have a working long-range radio back home?" Hansen asked. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure we can scrounge one or two up," Eric said. "Good, because we're going to need help making contact with every small town within 100 miles of Vegas," Hansen said. He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "They need to know what we're doing, so they don't get caught off guard when a horde of those things shows up on their doorstep," Hansen said. "We can certainly help with that, but what do I tell them?" Eric asked. Hansen began to speak, his mouth opening to respond, but he stopped himself, looking over to Foster and deferring to him. This was above his pay grade, a command decision rather than a tactical one. The captain paused for a moment to mull it over, his eyes distant as he considered the implications. Then he spoke. "You tell them that if they want to come to Vegas, we'll make it happen, but if they don't want to leave, we'll help them set up defenses as best we can," Foster said. "We should get in touch with Midnight Mike too. I'm sure he has some map enthusiast in his listening audience that would love to have a project to focus on, Parker said. A map enthusiast? Hansen asked. His tone carried skepticism, as if Parker had just suggested finding a unicorn wandering around the airfield. He set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. What? They exist, Parker said. He sounded defensive now, aware that his suggestion was being questioned. Magnus chuckled from his seat, clearly enjoying the back and forth between the two soldiers. I'm sure they do, but what do you think the odds are that one not only lives in Vegas but has survived this long? Hansen asked. Well, I mean, probably not great, Parker said. His confidence faltered under Hansen's questioning. He picked up his fork again, suddenly very interested in the remaining food on his plate. The logic was sound, even if the suggestion had merit. Eric watched the exchange with an amused expression, clearly entertained by the soldier's banter. When you talk to Mike, tell him that whoever takes on this project will get a suite on the Strip once we secure the city, Foster said. The offer was generous, almost extravagant. A suite on the Strip would have been worth thousands before the world ended. Now it represented something even more valuable, a symbol of normalcy and luxury in a world that had neither. Shitcap, I'm a map enthusiast, Hansen said. The deadpan delivery was perfect. For a moment, nobody was sure if he was serious, and then his face cracked into a grin. The entire table broke into laughter. The joke landed perfectly, cutting through the tension that had been building. Magnus's laugh was the loudest, a booming sound that echoed across the mess hall and drew looks from the other diners. Even Foster cracked a smile, shaking his head at Hansen's opportunism. The man was shameless, and everyone appreciated it. Andrea walked up with a tray of food, one plate for herself and one for her father. The plates were piled high with the same meal the others were eating, steam still rising from the hot food. She looked at the group, all of them still chuckling and wiping tears from their eyes. Her expression showed curiosity mixed with mild confusion, as if she had walked into the middle of an inside joke. I feel like I missed something, Andrea said. She set the trays down carefully, making sure not to spill anything. Her father reached for his plate, nodding his thanks. It's nothing big, honey, Eric said. Unless you happen to know a map enthusiast who knows the area, in which case it's a big deal, Hansen said. He continued laughing as Andrea took a seat next to her father, pulling the chair out and settling in. She picked up her fork, about to dig into her meal. Instead of joining in the laughter, though, her expression shifted. Something Hansen had said triggered a memory, and her eyes lit up with recognition. It was the look of someone who had just solved a puzzle, as if a light bulb had clicked on in her mind. What about Mr. Pat? Andrea asked. The table fell quiet. The laughter died instantly, replaced by focused attention that was almost physical in its intensity. All eyes turned to Andrea, who looked around at the sudden silence with some confusion. The shift in mood was dramatic, from jovial to serious in the span of a heartbeat. Who the hell is Mr. Pat? Parker asked. He leaned forward in his seat, his earlier amusement replaced by genuine interest. If Andrea had a lead, they needed to hear it. He was my state history teacher in high school. He loved the local history, had a bunch of historical maps of Vegas and the area surrounding it. Is that what you're looking for? Andrea asked. She looked between the faces at the table, trying to gauge if she had understood correctly. The intensity of their attention suggested she was on the right track. Hansen let out a sigh. He dropped his head, his hand coming up to rub his face. The timing was too perfect. The coincidence too improbable. It's just not fair. Some girl who isn't even old enough to gamble is going to get a penthouse suite on the Strip, Hansen said. Who said I'm not old enough to gamble? Andrea asked. Are you 21? Hansen asked. Andrea smirked, her expression shifting to something playful and challenging. She looked the sergeant right in the eyes, holding his gaze without flinching. Are you going to tell me no if I sit down at the poker table? Andrea asked. She continued staring him down, her confidence unwavering. The challenge hung in the air between them, and Hansen felt his resolve crumble under her steady gaze. Eventually, he broke into laughter, unable to maintain his serious expression. Well, I fold, Hansen said. He made the hand gestures of throwing in his cards, his hands moving in an exaggerated motion as if tossing chips across a table. The action prompted more laughter from everyone at the table. Even Eric chuckled, clearly proud of his daughter's quick wit. Parker shook his head, grinning as he took another bite of his food. Magnus raised his glass in a mock toast to Andrea, acknowledging her victory in the verbal sparring match. Foster watched the exchange with an amused expression, pleased to see his people relaxed and joking after such a harrowing day. The group continued enjoying their meals, the plates slowly emptying as they ate. They shared in the upbeat nature of their conversation, swapping stories from the mission and making plans for the days ahead. The mood was light, celebratory even, despite the exhaustion that showed in the lines around their eyes and the slump of their shoulders. Everybody knew they had dodged a bullet today, and they didn't take that for granted. The end.